Well, thank you so much for being here this afternoon. Special thanks to Fred Nachbauer my editor at Fordham University Press, to Sarita, to Magda, and of course to the Center for Jewish History, Center for Jewish History, and thank you to all of you who are also on Zoom. It's great to be here. In the first half of this presentation, I'm going to begin telling you a bit about how I came to my topic, something about its design, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about some specific sections in the book. In his novel, Judas, the Israeli writer Amos Oz declares, "What is between us and the Christians is a deep, dark affair which will go on for another 100 generations." This is a fitting way to begin a talk that will take you into the space in between, the space between Jewishness and Christianity, a space which over the last 7 to 8 years, I spent many, sometimes painful, sometimes bewildering, and always merely fascinating hours. So how did I stumble onto this topic? For most of my career, I've been thoroughly immersed in the world of Jewish letters, largely as a way of thickening my understanding about the cultural function of Jewish American poetry. To be sure, I knew about the Eucharist. After all, I regularly teach powerful poets like Hopkins and John Donne, for whom Christianity is central to their essential vision. But other than that, I knew little. Frankly, I had little interest in living in America we call the dominant religion. All of that changed about 8 years ago when I attended the annual conference of the American Association of Religious Studies. Reading through the program, I noticed that an old friend from college, Mark Bretler, was speaking. I didn't pay much attention to what he was talking about, but I knew that since he had a stellar reputation as a Hebrew Bible scholar, it was bound to be interesting. However, nothing prepared me for the swell of energy filling the packed room, energy generated by a gathering of Jewish and Christian scholars debating the then newly published Jewish Annotated New Testament. The Jewish Annotated New Testament, which Mark had co-edited. I took a deep breath, looked around, and wondered, what interest could the New Testament possibly hold for a Jewish studies scholar? Yet at that point, I was one of them, a relatively literate, actively identified Jew whose knowledge of the New Testament didn't extend much beyond the first verse of the Gospel of John, since the idea of originary word, logos, is a staple in literary studies. After the session, I went straight to the book exhibit, bought a copy of what I call J-Ant, where I first encountered the term holy envy, the first step in an intellectual journey that resulted in my book. I started to read and was immediately caught up by a phrase that was wholly new for me, holy envy, offered up by Swedish theologian Christer Stendahl as one of his 3 rules requisite for religious understanding. Stendahl never explained the term fully, other than enjoining his congregants to leave room for holy envy. As a result, numerous efforts have been made to flesh out this evocative locution, and here I offer mine. Holy envy. That is what's missing from most interfaith encounters, calling for a more active, demanding, effective condition than the dispassionate tolerance that typically presides over such meetings. Stendahl challenges us to be genuinely vulnerable and to recognize that there may be something about another faith that is genuinely lacking in one's own, and thus to risk experiencing in all of its pain and discomfort the shameful condition we call envy. With this term, as I understand it, Stendahl means us to know that real interfaith encounters require more than polite mutual tolerance. Instead, such meetings demand that one not merely be open to recognizing what is admirable about a faith tradition other than one's own, but also open to actively recognizing that a different tradition has features absent from one's own faith, thus acknowledging a genuine lack and recognizing it as an object of envy. Sometimes such religious forays can be challenging, painful, and maybe even dangerous. Like many intellectual projects, this one is rooted in a personal narrative. The idea of the word border zone in my subtitle has been, of course, part of an academic discourse for a long time, starting perhaps with Gloria Anzaldua's seminal work, Borderlands. But Jews also have a long, complicated history when it comes to borders and boundaries. Early in the Hebrew Bible, the Israelites are known by others as Ivrim, Jews in the Anglicized version. That is, the crosser-overs who traversed the Euphrates River. Interestingly enough, this term appears only when Ivrim interact with non-Ivrim. In other words, there is something distinctive, different about being a border crosser, something that sets this group apart from others. Despite this designation, or perhaps because of it, Jews are a people obsessed with setting firm boundaries, dietary boundaries, temporal boundaries, and interpersonal boundaries, particularly when it comes to relationships with non-Jewish others. For all of our well-intentioned rhetoric about welcoming the stranger, an injunction based on our own long sojourn in foreign lands, we too have struggled for much of our history with a fear of the other. Indeed, we should note that the word Ivrim shares the same Hebrew root with ayin vet resh as aveira, meaning transgression, a violation of a sacred boundary. Many of the more injurious averot, transgressions, are occasioned by Jewish, non-Jewish interaction. For many years, my Judaism was grounded in this particular linguistic variation, crossing as transgression, a stain to be studiously avoided. From my mid-teens well into my 30s, I lived as an Orthodox Jew. My world was defined by boundaries. I strictly observed the laws of the Shabbat, Sabbath, including those dictating that on the Sabbath, one can carry objects only within an area demarcated by an eruv, a boundary space determined according to Jewish law. But long before I took it upon myself to observe these strictures, I knew that there were certain boundaries that were inviolate, specifically boundaries between Jews and non-Jews. I didn't grow up in an Orthodox family. My father was an ardent secular Zionist who sent me to an Orthodox day school so that I could learn Hebrew. My mother, in particular, who grew up as one of only 5 Jewish families in Shawnee, Oklahoma, was very social and had many non-Jewish friends. Nevertheless, I grew up with a clear sense of difference, us and them, Jews and Goyim, a memory, just one here. I was 30 and I was standing at my grandmother's graveside as her body was about to be buried. As is customary, family and friends lined up to help shovel dirt over the casket, a sign of love and respect. A non-Jewish friend took up the shovel. My father grabbed the shovel out of the friend's hand and shoved him aside, thinking that halakhically, according to Jewish laws, Jews should only be buried by other Jews. I want to stress here that my father had exquisite manners and was a secular Jew, but his own schooling in the primacy of non-Jewish Jewish boundaries was so deeply ingrained that it overrode all other courtesies, customs, and considerations. I've thought about this moment many times over the years, and I'm only now beginning to understand the consequences of being schooled in a worldview that insisted upon inviolate religious boundaries, a perspective informed by acute ambivalence, even hostility towards the non-Jewish other. My intellectual and scholarly understanding of Jewish and Christian histories was also one of a firmly boundaried world, a radical parting of the ways, a fundamentally asymmetrical relationship. Up until 20 years ago or so, these were the phrases that dominated most academic accounts of the relationship between Judaism and Christianity, especially in the annals of early Jewish history. But this model has been thoroughly revised by scholars such as Daniel Boyarin, Philip Alexander, Mark Himmelfarb, Paula Fredrickson, and Peter Shreiber, who have been busily mining the depths of writing in the Tanaitic period, spanning roughly from the late 1st century to the early part of the 4th century, to show how what was once described as a static model of relationship, which cast Judaism as the parent of Christianity, the child who left home without looking back, is considerably messier, more fluid, and a more interesting dynamic of relationship. Boyarin, for example, likens the relationship to that of twins joined at the hip with no surgeon in sight. In the wake of this paradigm shift, a number of disciplinary fields, including theology and modern history, have begun re-examining their own respective accounts of Jewish Christian inquiry. That said, my field, literary studies, has lagged far behind. Instead of viewing Christianity as an aesthetically coercive force to be indulged or resisted, I want to propose a more nuanced approach. For as scholars have repeatedly observed, these religious borders, long viewed as absolute, are produced through discursive, linguistically deft acts. By exploring literary texts that flourish in the fissures marking the Jewish Christian border zone, texts that dwell in this place of in-betweenness, in the interstices between languages, cultures, and religion, I mean to pursue one of Boyarin's really important questions. He asks, what creative use can be made out of problematic desire, which is how he casts the Christian-Jewish interaction. He asks, not only what pleasures does it engender, but also what use can it be in the world? That is, how do these texts deepen our understanding of the challenges, demands, and rewards of engaging the religious other? Once I fastened upon these questions, I discovered that what I call the border zone, the place where Jewish writers and scholars engage Christianity, is actually rife with emotion. Daniel Boyarin is one of the most prominent gladiators in the field of Jewish Christian history and theology. Not only is he creative and thorough, he is incredibly passionate. When I began my own study, I was immediately struck by how he describes his scholarly vocation. He confesses to, quote, a strange attraction, to, quote, being in love with some manifestations of Christianity. It is a problematic desire, not entirely unlike, quote, the love that binds an abusive couple to each other. A love that almost would not dare to say its name. Problematic desire? Yes. Each chapter of my book focuses on a particular emotional response occasioned by the Jewish Christian border zone. Problematic emotions such as shame, estrangement, and of course, envy. Here's some highlights. Shame. Shame. Growing up on the Lower East Side, the young Louis Zukowski lived between the English and Yiddish-speaking world. When it came time to go to college, and this is him here, it's an image from his graduating class of 1924, he chose Columbia, home of the Great Books program over NYU, where other Jewish literati like Yaakov Glatstein were schooled. There he immersed himself in the study of English literature, developing an affection for Christian imagery and for the language of the New Testament. Determined to find his way into this world of Christian high art, Zukowski takes an unexpected route, proceeding counterintuitively. Rather than trying to pass or downplay his foreignness, he turns to Yiddish as an aesthetic resource, a strategic means to an end. He envisions a two-way street, a dialogic relationship. Indeed, it could be said that Zukowski anticipates what later, here we go. What later a group of Jewish theologians include in their guide to Jewish Christian dialogue, There they insist on its bilateral nature. They write, this is David Novak, the greatest temptation for a Jew is Christianity, and the greatest temptation for a Christian is Judaism. So the Yiddish-speaking Zhukovsky chooses to write poetry in English, and we find the writer in the throes of desire and envy for the aesthetic treasures available to the Christian other. For him, this is really embodied in Bach's St. Matthew's Passion. It's a desire that provokes a shamefaced and shameful repudiation of Yiddish, the very language deployed in the religious conflict. So what follows? A deep descent into one of the uglier emotive states of being, shame. How else to understand the extravagant, explosive display of scatological poetry? See, for me, these jiggers, these dancing bucks, dum, 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 pump, oh, shucks, what clavicle, bum, 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 to dum, not in the say, but in the sounds, hey, hey, the way to die, 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 tap, slow, die, wake up, oh, Savior, today, choose Jews, shoes, or whose, anyway, choose, go. The poet delivers this explosive performance while perched on his stoop to sit here, though no one asked me. He's an outsider, exiled by both Christians and Jews. Yiddish courses underneath, not explicitly, but as a submerged text. And I think here you can see the die, die, die and all of the play that's going on, but Christians and Jews are alike targeted. He takes on the crucifixion as well as chosenness. It's all pretty ugly. Playful? Yes. Jubilant? No. Underneath all the scatology and the punning, I don't hear triumph, but shame, ambivalence. A tribal response, shame, is triggered by the sense of falling short of others' expectations, of not being worthy, of viscerally embodied emotion, blushing, sweating, farting, blurting, stuttering. Shame makes manifest our intense longing for affirming connections with others, yet paradoxically can also lead to acute feelings of rejection, self-loathing, and estrangement. I wish I could tell you that it gets better. Well, it does, but first it gets worse. As a particularly troubling example of envy, we have the case of the poet Carl Shapiro, a well-known poet of the 40s and 50s, whom now hardly anyone reads. He is, I think, a singularly annoying but important denizen of the Jewish Christian Borderzone. Celebrated in the mid-40s for his war poetry, Shapiro launches a sharp critique of that problematic construction known as Judeo-Christianity, which is the signature effort on the part of the newly established National Conference of the Christians and Jews. Yet for all of his insight into the toxic anti-Semitism of Pound and Eliot, Shapiro becomes unhappily enmeshed in a dark web of emotions dominated by a particularly loathsome case of envy, which manifests itself in particularly ugly and cringe-worthy poems, including one poem about a teenage boy masturbating before his Catholic confirmation date. Here we go. And to confirm his sex, breathless and white, with benediction self-bestowed, he knelt, oh, tightly married to his childish grip, and unction smooth as holy oil fell from the vessel's level lip upon the altar cloth. Ick-worthy. But this account not only complicates the widely embraced notion of holy envy, but expands upon a host of anxieties besetting Jewish America in the 40s and 50s, including that of assimilation and anti-Semitism, which is a bit of a toggle. Finally, as an example of an emotion that I call estrangement, we have the poetry of Denise Lavertov. Perhaps nowhere Oh, there we go.
Just ignore it. Just
Okay. Indeed, perhaps nowhere is the challenge of living in the space in between Jewishness and Christianity explored more deeply than in the delicately wrought poems of spiritual estrangement and longing of Denise Levertov. One of the most fascinating chapters, if I say so myself, and the seed for this exploration began in the Center for Jewish History's archives, because it was there that I really worked out that Denise Levertov, spelled Levertov, was actually the daughter of Paul Philip Levertov, Levtoff. So here he is. Was born into a Hasidic family. Paul Nefeibel becomes a devoted follower of who he calls Rebbe Yeshua of Nazareth, and lives out his life as a lone Hasid in a Christian world. So Denise grew up in a world dictated by both Judaism and Christianity, parented by a father who believed them, quote, to be two phases of one and the same religion, two moments of the same divine human process. With this discovery, I started understanding my own deep-seated resistance to reading Denise simply as a Jewish poet, and began appreciating the complexity of her spiritual vision, her profound theological restlessness that was fueled by her own long sojourn in the Jewish Christian Borderzone. Here is one powerful expression of the longing she experiences and the emotional distance she had to traverse. Got it, good. Standoff. Assail God's hearing with gull screech, knife blades, cozen the saints to plead our cause, claiming grace abounding, God crucified on the resolve not to displume our unused wings, hears nailed palms, cannot beat off the flames of insistent sound, strident or plaintive, no annul to annul freedom, no reach to annul freedom, nor would God renege. Our shoulders ache, the abyss gapes at us. As my talk draws nearest to a close, and I'm looking forward to our conversation, I want to say something about where I ended up and how this project changed me, taking me places that I would have never gone before and allowing me to see things differently. Just two examples. As you know, I live in Salt Lake City, the home of the Church of the Latter-day Saints, a Christian denomination known, among other things, for its affection for Jews. Mostly, this is a good thing. Blatant anti-Semitic texts, for example, are swiftly and very publicly denounced. That said, sometimes such affection takes disquieting turns. Early on in this project, I had occasion to attend a Passover Seder, a ritual holiday meal hosted by BYU, Brigham Young University, the flagship university owned by the Church of Latter-day Saints. To be sure, such an event is hardly unique. Every year, assorted non-Jewish organizations provide opportunities for non-Jews to participate in some version of this ritual meal. Indeed, Lauren Davidson little cheekily describes Passover as the Jewish festival that non-Jews love to observe. Observe is indeed the operative word. On the one hand, it can mean to attentively notice. On the other hand, it can mean to actively fulfill or participate in a religious or legal form of obligation. The latter sense of the word plunges us into that messy territory known as cultural appropriation, an act entailing the inappropriate or unacknowledged adoption of the customs, practices, ideas of one people or society by members of another. This Seder, which I attended, activated both senses of the word observe. For what began as a thoughtfully designed educational experience ultimately crossed over into discomforting territory, affording me yet another lesson in the complex contours of the Jewish Christian Borderzone. The event is sponsored by BYU, is wildly popular. It's always sold out. And it's attended mostly by church members and a smattering of Messianic Jews. This is what I experienced. I enter a large ballroom packed with participants. After being directed to an empty seat at an otherwise full table, I turn my attention to the PowerPoint presentation in progress. Passover at the time of Gamliel and Jewish. Second Temple Judaism is very interesting to Mormons who see themselves as inheriting the temple tradition as a latter-day kingdom of Zion. At this point, I squirm a little bit at the idea of Seder as museum exhibit, but I can see the pedagogic value, and I try to settle into the moment. Then things take a disorienting turn as the leader announces that the lecture is over, and he dons what he explains is a kippah, yarmulke, skull cap, worn during prayer and by some all the time, some Jews. I stiffen as the leader tells the assembled to pour 2 fingers of wine, or in this case, grape juice, since Latter-day Saints don't drink alcohol, and proceeds to say the bracha, the blessing, in Hebrew, including the sacred name, Adonai Elokeinu, a non-Jew praise to the Jewish God as part of a performance. What I didn't fully recognize at the time, that this was a moment when the event stopped being strictly educational and became culturally, religiously problematic. Looking back over my notes later, I see that I had scrawled, "This isn't yours. It's mine." The Borderzone can be a lonely place, saturated with silence and loss. My table mates begin to pepper me with questions. "Do you know this all by heart? Have you been to a Seder before? You seem to know what you were doing." And I thought I was being discreet. "Is this what real Seders are like?" I don't dissemble, but I do explain that at my house, Seders are a little noisier and messier. And then I ask them about their interest in attending such an event. The answers are varied, but share a common theme. We identify with your story. We too struggle to be free. We too have food constraints. Listening to these responses, I start thinking about the limits of analogy. Is abstaining from alcohol or beverages in the Mormon tradition equivalent to Jewish dietary laws? And what about comparing a recent historically verifiable event, a grueling trek undertaken by nearly 3,000 Mormons over a period of 4 years, pushing handcarts from the Midwest to the West in search of religious freedom, to a mythic account chronicling more than 200 years of slavery brought to an end by divine intervention? Before I can reflect any further about the kinds of questions that arise when religions come in contact, I overhear my neighbor musing, "It is funny that Jews don't understand that Passover is really all about Jesus. After all, they were saved because of the blood of the Lamb on the doorpost." At this point, the Borderzone threatens to become a combat zone. In retrospect, I could have benefited from the sturdy wisdom of Amy Jill Levine, who is a warrior on the front lines of Jewish Christian relationships. She's taught me to be very wary of church-sponsored Seders, despite their educational benefits. At the very least, I would have been better prepared for what followed. As Levine understands it, many such occasions are problematic on 2 accounts. First, often designed as feel-good events, such performances help foster a romanticized relationship to Jewishness, thus absolving participants from the obligation to pursue hard but necessary conversations about Christian anti-Semitism. Second, in the interest of crafting a compelling narrative, these events tend to elide history, by presenting the Passover Seder as if an iteration of the Last Supper, a misconception that has been firmly disproved by any number of scholars. Actually, it's not even fully clear that the Last Supper was a Passover meal. It is not in John, which, according to Levine, is the most historically reliable of the Gospels. While the leader and author of the Seder I attended certainly made an effort to note how the ritual changes over time, the performance itself soft pedals history. After the afikomen, the last piece of matzah has been found and redeemed for one of BYU's famous mint brownies, the leader dramatically marks the end of the Jewish Seder by taking off his kippah and announcing, "Now I want to tell you why you should care about the Passover Seder." Bypassing the Gospel of John in favor of Luke, the leader gestures towards an image of Jesus at table with the apostles and cites, "Then he took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, 'This is my body, which is given for you.'" Seders, he continues, like this help us build bridges to our Jewish friends. But more importantly, and this is what he said, Jesus instituted the sacrament, and on this occasion we gather to celebrate not just his resurrection, but this time of redemption. For we know that Elijah appeared to Joseph Smith to sanctify the building of the first temple. He, Elijah, is with us. I looked quickly at my table mate, the same one who insisted that Passover is really all about Jesus, and without my asking, he said, 1836, Ohio, Elijah appeared in a vision. Then the leader asks us all to stand and welcome Elijah. For Christ has risen and redemption is at hand. A student opens the ballroom door and we turn in her direction. The leader raises the fourth cup, Elijah's cup, the cup of redemption, now rebranded as the cup of resurrection. We are all silent. For a full moment, we are silent. The Seder is over. As I'm leaving, I asked my neighbor, same one, how he felt during that long silence, which was both so full and so empty. Meeting my gaze, he says, holiness. I felt holiness. Later, I write about this experience for an online magazine called Faith Counts, recording how, despite all of its religiously problematic and invasive moves, the last moment lingers with me. I think about my own Seders, those of my friends, and how the moment when we open the door for Elijah is usually filled with giggles or silly pranks, as if to cover up our discomfort thinking about the Messiah. For if anyone really believes that the Messiah might arrive, they keep it to themselves. I describe feeling a pang of holy envy, acknowledging how my own lively, sometimes raucous Siddharim rarely allow space for such quiet, explicitly faith-filling moments. But there is more. As I struggle with my emotional response to the religious other, I realized that because I had spent the evening so intent on safeguarding my own religious boundaries, noting with irritation every moment that the leader trespassed onto my territory, I had missed an opportunity to venture into a space, another iteration of the border zone that Martin Buber calls the space of holy insecurity. So I'm just going to tie it up now here with speaking a little bit about the final image. So this is called Reliquary 2, and it's part of a series designed and assembled by the artist Beth Prensky. Prior to writing this book, I don't think I would have known what to make of this object, which she assembled to honor a decaying shul in New Haven. It's a simple bronze box with just a hint of gold trim surrounding an opening containing a talit, a Jewish prayer shawl. I think I would have felt discomforted. I might have looked away. I might have even dismissed it as an ill-conceived travesty, or at least barbed provocation. For the word reliquary brings to mind slow, meandering walks through shadowy cathedrals, peering at elaborate jewel-crusted constructions containing bones, hair, or bits of fabric belonging to a saint or a holy figure. My viewings were mostly colored by a mixture of schooled respect, bewilderment, and honestly, just a bit of distaste for the idea of revering a person, much less a corpse, seemed alien to my own account of holiness. But after having spent so much time in the Jewish Christian Borderzone, I wanted to look more closely and think more deeply about Krensky's piece. For a reliquary containing a clearly recognizable Jewish prayer garment and crafted to honor a once thriving Jewish place of worship demanded attention. Never having given reliquaries much thought before, I learned that rather than simply fetishizing the dead, as I had surmised, reliquaries, a religious and aesthetic tradition that harkens back to the 4th century, are believed to have a restorative, indeed transformative function. They began as a response to the traumas suffered by early Christian martyrs, whose bodies were often subjected to such acts of desecration as burning and fragmentation. By enshrining the remains, reliquaries served a sacred function, compensating for the trauma by providing a sacred space where wholeness can be restored and access to the divine can be achieved. By enclosing that which is of the divine, reliquaries conceal as much as they reveal, making vivid the intimate and ultimately mysterious nature of the divine encounter. Turning back to Krensky's reliquary 2, I stopped clenching my jaw and began to see. The bronze case is small, less than a foot high. The window is covered with mica, a prayer-thin mineral to which Krensky is drawn, both because it is translucent, but also because of its metaphysical resonances. In the world of gemstones, mica is believed to help one see the self as well as others more clearly and without judgment. In this instance, the choice seemed especially right, since so much of my book and my own intellectual and psychological process has been about trying to learn to see the religious other as dispassionately and fully as possible, even when the writers I consider are caught up in dense webs of difficult emotion. While traditional reliquaries are often thickly covered in gold and jewel encrusted, Krensky's rendition takes a lighter touch. Just a bit of gold leaf trims the window. In this way, Krensky casts her reliquary in dialogue with Catholic tradition, refraining from wholesale appropriation to achieve her own aesthetic theologic ends. So what of the talit, the prayer shawl contained within? It's not clear from where this particular talit originates. There's nothing to indicate if it once belonged to a member of the Orchard Street Shul, which was commemorating, or if the artist Krensky acquired it elsewhere. Indeed, the anonymity of this ritual prayer garment seems to be precisely the point. Unlike the bits of stone, of bone, or scraps of cloth housed within a traditional reliquary, the talit does not signify the presence of a specific holy person. Rather, in its plainest meaning, the shawl signifies prayer, an act of sacred encounter with divine other. You can see that on the very top there, the prayer that you say upon donning the garment is worked into the top. Typically, most Jews, men, and increasingly women, wear a talit while praying. Hurrying either to join or start a service, many, myself included, often say the prayer very quickly under our breaths while wrapping the talit around our shoulders, focusing on what lies ahead. We take little time to consider how the act of enwrapping symbolically enacts a moment of holy reparation, a way of setting to right one's relationship with the divine other. Indeed, prior to this inquiry, I knew little about this waiting meaning. That is, until I saw a talit as part of a reliquary, an enclosure meant to serve as the site of sacred restoration. And I felt compelled to learn more about the ritual garment that I have worn regularly for more than 20 years. So it seems right to end here with this image, a border zone artifact which dwells in the space in between Jewishness and Christianity, a space alive with new meanings.